Hello and welcome back to Pali-Studies. If you wish to read or translate the Pali Canon, then this channel is here to help you learn the Pali language. Pali, like most languages, has three main time periods: the past, the present, and the future. The present tense is easy. That's what's happening right now. And we use it to make statements of fact, give commands, and express possibilities. We covered the future tense and these three moods in the last tutorial. Now we're going to skip ahead and look at the future. Now obviously we use the future tense to make statements about things which haven't yet happened. In English, we mark the future tense by use of modal verbs like will or shall. In Pali, as well as this simple future mood, which technically is called the future indicative, there's also what is known as the conditional mood, and this is used to make statements about things which aren't likely to happen. But in this tutorial, we're just going to look at the simple future in the Pali language. The present tense in Pali is formed on what we call the present stem. Now, Pali English dictionaries usually list their verbs in the third person present. So to get to the present stem, all we have to do is knock off the third person ending, and what's left is the present stem. The future and the past or aorist tenses, although sometimes they're formed on this present stem, usually they're formed on what is called the verbal root. If you remember from the tutorial on the mechanics of verb inflection, a verb can be broken down into parts, and we can keep breaking off parts of the verb until we're left with the smallest meaningful part, and this is termed the verb root. So in English, the word civilization comes from the verb root civ, which means a person who is a member of a state. And the same is true in Pali. All verbs are derived from a more basic root. Okay, so let's now jump right in and see how future verbs are formed. Because we're more familiar with the present stem, let's first look at how future verbs are formed on this stem. At the end of this tutorial, I'll give you a simple way in which you can identify the future tense when reading Pali. But there's actually no reason to be scared by the mechanics of verb inflection. In fact, forming the future tense on the present stem is quite simple. First, you take a present stem and drop the end vowel. And then we add an inflectional infix, issa, to form what is called the future base, or sometimes the future stem. Issa is the future tense infix, and so when we see this combination of letters, we know that there's a good chance that the verb is in the future tense. Finally, to this future base, we add one of the primary personal endings. These endings are actually the same as those that we saw with the present tense. We add them in order to define grammatical person and number, singular or plural. And if you remember, the verbs in Pali always agree with their subjects in person and number. So far, so good. Now, many Pali grammar guides present verb inflection with a series of what are called paradigm tables. So if we look at these briefly here, the stem gacha in short A, meaning to go, becomes gachisati, meaning he will go in third person singular. In this way, the 10 verb conjugations of the present tense can be narrowed down into stems which end in just one of 4 vowels. And as the final vowel of the present stem was dropped in the process of forming the future, this means the paradigm tables all look pretty much the same. There is an exception, and that is present stems which end in the letter E. These stems retain their final vowel, and so the future infix becomes issa. Well, that's how the future tense is formed on the present stem. So let's now look at how it's formed directly on the verbal root. Well, the good news is the method remains pretty much the same. First, we take a verb root, and to this we add the future infix, and then to this new base we add one of the primary personal endings. But with roots, things are a little more involved. Now remember, at the end of this tutorial, I'll give you a simple way by which you can identify a future tense verb when you're reading Pali. But I think it's important to know just how we get there. Now the process I've just outlined has a couple of intermediate steps. When the future infix is added directly to a verbal root, first it usually is strengthened, and this is sometimes called gunation. We'll look at this in a moment. Unlike present stems, verbal roots can end in almost any letter of the alphabet. So if a verbal root ends in a vowel, the initial vowel of the infix is dropped, leaving just sa. Whereas if it ends in a consonant, 9 times out of 10, the initial vowel of the infix is retained. However, occasionally, the initial vowel is also dropped, which results in the coming together of 2 consonant sounds, and this produces what is called assimilation, and we'll look at this in a second too. And finally, to this new verbal base, a personal primary ending is added to give both person and number. Let's now take a look at the new processes. Gunation is actually a hangover from Sanskrit, where a verb can have 2 forms, either weak or strong. So to gunate means to strengthen the initial vowel of the root. Thankfully, it only affects the vowel sounds I and U, and occasionally that of E. So when strengthened, the vowel sound I becomes E, and also if this is followed by another vowel, it becomes Ea. U becomes O, and if followed by a vowel, Av. Another change affects a long A. If this is followed by a double consonant, a long A becomes short. If we take some examples, the root da to give becomes dasa. Chid to cut becomes chid. Ni to lead becomes ne or neissa. Mooch to free becomes moch. And the root bu to be becomes either bo or bavissa. When 2 consonant sounds come together, often they can be hard or awkward to articulate, and this can result in the sounds merging and producing a new sound. And this is called assimilation, and simply means to become similar. So for instance, in English, when the words hand and bag come together, this results in handbag. The D and the B produce an M sound, because both the M sound and the following B sound are both bilabial consonants, which means they are formed in a similar place in the mouth. Cup and board produces cupboard. And in fast speech, bless and you become bless you, and meet and you become meet you. And the same is true in the Pali language. When 2 consonants meet, one sound tends to take on the characteristics of the other. And because Pali is a phonetic language, which means it's spelt how it sounds, these small changes in sounds are reflected in the spelling. Now this is part of a much larger subject called sandhi, which is how words join. So to keep things simple, if we just look at how the future infix, sa, joins with various consonants, we can see that there's a pattern, and results in two new sound forms, cha or ka. Now if we put this all together, the root da, to give, in third person becomes dasati, he will give. The root lab, to get, becomes lachati, he will get, and the form labisati is also found. The root chid, to cut, becomes chechati, he will cut. Ni, to lead, becomes neisati or nesati. The root much, to free, becomes mokati, he will free. And finally the root bu becomes bhavasati, he will be, and the form bosati is also found. Well, that's a lot of information, so let's recap. The future tense verb can be formed on the present stem. First we drop the end vowel, and then we add the future infix, issa. But more commonly, future verbs are formed directly on the root. The verbal root is usually first strengthened, and if it ends in a vowel, the leading vowel of issa is dropped, and sa is added directly. And if the root ends in a consonant, usually the leading vowel of issa is retained, but occasionally with some roots, just the infix sa is used, and this will result in assimilation. And finally, to this new verb base, a primary personal ending is added. Okay, so I promised you a simple way to recognise the future verb ending. If we simply add the future infix issa to the primary personal endings, we can create the following table in active voice. So if you see one of these 6 endings on a Pali verb, it's most likely in the future tense. And as a few roots will undergo assimilation, we can add 2 more tables. Now it should be noted that not every verb with one of these endings is necessarily in the future. Some verbs will have these letter forms as a natural part of the root, and that's why it's important to understand the mechanics of inflection. But hopefully these tables will now make it easy for you to spot the future tense when you're reading the Pali language.